this in sort of the context of some of the starts of the questions that I suppose Kerith and I were having in conversations. If you could move us on to the next slide, please. What we then did was undertake 8 semi-structured interviews across a number of different disciplines. Now, we identified this through a committee paper that had gone to our university's Learning and Teaching Committee, which essentially looked at best practice of AI in the curriculum, and as part of that then how colleagues had adapted their practice in integrating AI in assessment. And we were really interested about what does that look like then from the assessment designer's perspective. So we invited 8 people to come along. So we wanted to make sure we had a range of disciplines, which we've categorized as computing, life sciences and social sciences, and the examples are across levels 7 to 10. We also adapted our interview questions from Bridgeman et al.'s study on how universities design assessments, which essentially cover the sort of process of designing assessment. How does that then look for scaffolding to students? What do they mean by sort of criticality, critical thinking within the assessment? What I will say is Bridgeman's study was based in Australia, and you are going to see lots of references to Australia today, because in this space they are much further forward, I would argue, than maybe we are in the UK and to an extent Europe. So you'll see these references to that quite a lot. So over to Kerith.
Okay, so this is the bit where we get into findings from our thematic analysis. And what we've got, we talked about lane, what lane are we in? So we're thinking about how are the students being asked to engage with AI, because I know that some of you were thinking about, is this about staff engaging and so on, and there's a little bit of staff engagement, but it's sort of looking around that. And we've got essentially here 3 lanes. And we'll come back to this and refine this as we go through. But our first lane that we discovered was what we call AI output only. So if we're thinking about the use of AI, the use of AI is by the staff member, the academic, choosing to give the student AI output. So they've been the one in control of the tool. They're the one who have put in the prompt and something has been, if you like, spat out. And then that is given to the students for a particular reason. And we focused, because of the nature of the audience today, we're going to look in more detail at how that looked in the computing module. We then got what we call limited collaboration with AI, and this focuses on student use of AI. And the students were asked, as a tiny percentage of the final grade for that particular assessment, to use AI. So it might have been use AI to create a plan, but everything that then came after that, and there would be a grade for the plan, and everything that came after that would be without the use of AI. And then we had some modules, and again, we'll do a case study here of computing, which is, and you'll notice we've got level difference here. This is at level 10. Is everybody on the call going to be familiar enough with 7 to 10? So should be okay. Please put in the chat if you're not. Apologies. Just suddenly thinking about the audience there. Please, we can qualify that. But we've got computing at level 10, and in this case, anything went. Right, so the students could do whatever they wanted at any point, right through from being given the assessment to right to submission point. So those are our early findings, if you like. We've got 3 lanes. We've got this AI output, so in other words, the academic has chosen to engage with the AI, given some output. Second one, students are being allowed to use limited, tiny percentage of the mark. I mean, we are talking tiny percentage, so it's 5% of unit 1 of possibly a 3-unit module, which is, you know, again, you know, you've got 3 modules in a term, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes infinitely smaller as you sort of look at how that would accumulate. And that's where we are. And then we've got these other ones. So case study 1. Is that you for case study? I'm back to case study 1. Yes. Okay, case study 1. Here we go. Let's get into it. So for this, as I say, students are not engaging directly. So it doesn't mean there's no AI, because the AI output has come from the academic. And the design was very scaffolded. So they're given this output and they have to analyze this output to see whether or not the GenAI generated code is correct. So they're using their skills, their knowledge, which has been taught, to look and critically analyze this. And if you like, stakeholders, yes, the students are stakeholders, yes, the academics are stakeholders, but who else are we kind of considering in this picture? And what else came up for the interviews? And it was the industry. What are the students going into? What are the expectations of that industry, that they've got foundational knowledge? And any PSRBs as well would be feeding in here. And the outcome was that there was strong student engagement with this task, with this ethical reflection on whether generative AI could or couldn't code well, what were the differences, how else could it be approached, that kind of thing. And it really felt that it developed critical thinking and an understanding. So you're building their AI literacy skills in the sense of they understood the limitations of the particular AI tool that had been used to generate the output. This was at level 7. So this is students coming in at that level, building foundational knowledge. Whereas at level 10, what you've got at level 10 was some weekly exercises with lab sheets and lectures. And here it was quite interesting. Again, you could use a generative AI tool to get to an answer for the weekly quiz or a weekly exercise. But you also had to evaluate whether or not those outputs were any use. So now the students are prompting. Now the students are again doing that evaluative piece, but they're the ones who have got to actually put in the prompt in the first place. And reflecting on that again and seeing whether or not the AI generated content has value. Again, looking at what the industry expectations are, because they're now nearer to graduation, and the outcomes in this. It was quite interesting, but coming out of the interview was this idea that the students, rather than seeing formulaic answers, because of the AI outputs, there were actually differences in the way that the answers were being given. So yeah, it felt that it had been reducing anxiety around GenAI use as well, because it was still quite scaffolded and it developed their confidence. So these are two of, just to give you a little bit more insight into the types of conversations that we were having. And then,
when we then looked across all of our case studies, one of the things that really jumped out to us, and the two examples we wanted to share were deliberate because they aligned to the same programs. And so that's when Kerith was talking about sort of levelness as well. That for me is really important, because what we see there is AI output only at level 7, looking at sort of threshold concepts, all the way through to level 10, where we are looking for, I suppose, much more criticality and application, etc. And so we can see that from those two examples, and then I'm sure there's a range in between on these programs. But when we looked at this more broadly from across all of our interviews, what we actually saw in practice were these types of things driving people's decision making. What we have then sort of looked at in terms of academic sense making, we'll come on to that a little bit more in a second, because it was one of those moments for us where we were having the conversations and analysing, we came across this paper and everything just made sense in the world temporarily. But what we really saw then was stakeholders being a real influence, whether that be the industries, partners that colleagues were working with, whether that be the PSRBs and the requirements there, or whether it be things like university strategies and a sense of a direction that the university was going in and wanting to respond to that, being in a position to then say, well, look, this is how I'm responding to this trend. So stakeholders in a broad sense, also student feedback as well and colleagues' feedback. So stakeholders was really key. Then student factors, recognizing that not all students had equity of access to the GenAI tools. So how do we do that? Now, as a university, we've made much better strides over recent months in terms of how all students can access Copilot and various things like that. But also then AI literacy. So how are our students actually prepared and how are we going to scaffold that preparation? I come back to those two case studies as a good example. AI output only, being able to critique and really understand what's going on with an AI generated code, all the way through then to actually collaborating with AI in a much broad sense, and everything in between in the levels. But also what was really key and fascinating across the different disciplines was what individual assessment designers referred to as critical thinking and how that varied by the discipline. Now, there's lots of literature that also talks about that. So what might be a definition of critical thinking in one subject can actually look very different in another. And that was a really interesting thing that influenced then why, for example, a level 9 assessment was AI output only compared to a level 9 assessment in another discipline being a limited collaboration. So those nuances in that. Also, developments and just saying, well, actually, I can't outrun this, so I might as well try and embrace in some way and encourage and provide some boundaries. So the pace and the limitations then essentially being huge factors into their sense making, which in turn designed the assessment, and then obviously the students experience that. Now, the reason why student attainment, knowledge and skills, we simply have not looked at that for the purpose of the study. So we have absolutely no idea really, apart from what assessment designers reported to us in those interviews, what was going on then in terms of the student experiences. But for us, it was about the inputs into, I suppose, the design of the assessment and the sense making that comes from that.
Next one. Okay, so Jack already referenced this paper, and it was just a moment of magic. We were like, oh, somebody's done a study into academic sense making. This is really interesting. So we use that as a lens to suddenly look at, again, you've got all of this information coming in that's influencing the designer of the assessment, and then they are making choices. But how can we understand some of those choices as well? So you can see here, you've got the continuation of practice, and at one end, you've got this idea of ignorance, but that I would suggest it's not something that we looked at in our case studies, was it? But what we did have was what's sort of sitting in the middle, this idea of decoupling. And this was an interesting one. So it was like, yes, I have an acknowledgement that this is coming down the road, that all of these things are important and everything else. I'm a little bit tired at the moment. And, you know, maybe I need to decouple a little bit from what's going on. And how can I do this without causing myself at this point a massive amount of work about having to learn about all the different tools and all the different possible applications? What's a quick win? So then you've got in the compliance, we've got two sets, and we've kind of coupled them up together, haven't we? We put defiant and defeatist together following the literature, and strategic and optimistic as two groups within what was called compliance. And this is really where behaviours alter, and there is a complete sort of rethinking of both the assessment, the sort of learning outcomes in the assessment, the way in which students will engage with the assessment, and so on. So we'll have a look at that and come back to this idea again. But if you haven't read it before, I would say that Deng's Academic Sense Making is a really good article. And you may start to recognize yourself. Am I at the quick win stage? Am I an early adopter of AI? Have I had the time and the space? Because, you know, there's a recognition that we're all very busy. And we had the time and the space to really sit down and look at this in the round. So where are you along this journey? Okay, so solutions. There are solutions that have been proposed in the literature. And in fact, one of these solutions is quite popular, and that is known as the AI assessment scale, or AS, I don't know. Anyway, if you get yourself in trouble with that one, can you? With the AI assessment scale. And this started off as a traffic light system. So if you haven't seen the latest version, it's very pastel. And it's to get away from this hierarchy of red being something and then, you know, this green for go. So it's possible that you would look at this all the way around in these different segments. But again, what are we looking at? Because if the assessments are taken in what we call a non-secure environment, you might know it as a sort of take-home or a piece of coursework rather than an examination or in-class test, which is a quite controlled environment. Can you be sure, these are the types of questions we would ask ourselves, can you be sure that students are staying within a required segment? And there is no foolproof detection out there. You have indicators, but it's not foolproof detection. So we come back to the paper that we read early on, Corbyn's one, about the absurd line. Are we actually creating absurd lines for the students and ourselves? Trying to work out which segment we're in and so on. And therefore, I suppose, ultimately, can we be assured of our learning outcomes? Okay. There is the second way that's also quite popular in the literature, particularly in Australia, because this has been adopted across several institutions in Australia. It's gaining some traction in Europe. Ireland are looking at this as well. And this is what's known as the two-lane approach. So in the two-lane approach, and we've taken this directly from the very early paper Liu and Bridgeman put forward, they said that there should be, it's kind of a binary, isn't it, really? This idea that you don't have any AI, but we're going to come back to that. Remember, we had 3 lanes. You've got this sense of no AI, and that's in a secure environment, but it doesn't mean the written exam. You've got other things that you might be doing in class in the secure environment there, or you might be showing some practical skills. You might be having an in-person conversation. All of that type of thing might be in your lane 1. Whereas in the other lane, it's assessment for and as learning, and it's open, it's unsecured, and essentially, yes, you scaffold the use of AI, build the AI literacy of your student, but essentially they can do what they want with it. So, as I say, we'll talk you through.
Yeah.
Where we see this all coming together.
So what we then looked at doing in thinking about those 3 lanes we had identified is actually, how does that look in terms of the 2-lane approach? And it's actually 3 lanes, a little bit too, we're bouncing around, and actually we need to try and frame this in a slightly different way. And I've got, this is where some thoughts and ramblings come in into how we might be able to do that. But if you take, for example, AI output only, now I actually really like these assessments because I think they are level appropriate. I think they are engaging with AI without engaging with AI, engaging with AI output. So I really like that. It aligns lovely to lane 1. You know, it's about creating that secure environment to essentially test those threshold concepts and developing those AI literacy skills. Brilliant. Let's do more of that, and let's focus on that sort of levelness. And level 7, to an extent level 8, are perfect levels to be doing that type of thing. Lane 2, an unlimited collaboration and just sort of going for it, is absolutely, again, fine. Because actually one of the things that was clear from the interviews is there were almost no rules, but with rules. The boundaries were set and they were clear. The only issue with that was when our participants were saying, I allowed unlimited collaboration for Unit 1, but no AI was allowed for Unit 2. And then they said, I suppose I did have more academic misconduct cases in Unit 2. So that's why I come back to thinking about, establishing those lines of both institutional, programme and module approach. And those three things almost need to be aligned to an extent. And maybe the two-lane approach helps us frame that in a much simplistic way, enabling us then to design our assessments that ensure a sort of secure environment and an open environment. Limited collaboration has lane 2 characteristics, but when we then think about that question about where is the line, it's quite a hard one. In some cases, people were saying you could use it for sort of planning. In other cases, that sort of limited collaboration was almost no AI. It was slightly, when you got into the real detail of it, slightly complicated. And so therefore, it was a really interesting thing in sort of mapping those things out together. However, go to the next slide. This is where my sort of ramblings come in a little bit, because one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about is, and this is partly about not trying to reinvent the wheel and trying to keep things simple, both for ourselves as assessment designers and ultimately our students who then complete those assessments. And if we take our learning outcomes that are brilliant and beautiful and shiny and it's all wonderful, and we take our assessments in our assessment type. So at Abertay, we have a defined typology, which is quite broad. I'm sure at other universities, you'll have similar typologies, whether it be, for example, exam or coursework or professional conversation or whatever it is. You take those things. And then I suppose you've got to think about what is it you actually want the student to do. And the ABC framework, now this is also in a fabulous book called AI and Digital Education or something. I think I got the title right. We can send the link around. And the ABC framework is identified in that. And that's L'Oreal's essential learning types. So acquisition, investigation, practice, discussion, collaboration, production. So if we think about, say, our level 7 computing example, great learning outcome, great assessment type, perfect. What actually learning type is it? Well, I would say it's probably, I suppose it's a little bit of acquisition, but it's also a little bit of sort of practicing and really getting into that as a learning type. And it's a secure lane. So in terms of thinking about going through almost a checklist for us to help understand what our assessments are, we can say learning outcome, great, typology, great. We're getting them to practice something, we're doing that in a secure environment. The boundaries then become established. Whereas in our level 10 example that we talked about earlier, that was very much about collaboration as a learning type from L'Oreal, and it was an open lane of assessment. That immediately helps us establish the boundaries. And rather than the, but if you do this, this happens, and if you do that, then this happens. So maybe having a sort of process and a two-lane approach is the way in which we can help establish those boundaries, get ourselves in lane, and make it really clear to both ourselves, our colleagues, our institution, and ultimately our students where we are and what we expect. And so maybe, as I say, those learning types, L'Oreal's learning types, and choosing a lane become really important. And that's essentially where our thinking is at the moment. The academic sense-making provides us an insight into that decision-making, which is also important. And that's almost, by talking to those colleagues, helps me think about how can we simplify this for everybody? And how can we, if we go back to that sense-making, recognise, as Kerith said, that some people are not engaging with this at all. They're your head in the sand. How can we make it easier for them, as well as making it then easier for people who are on that journey of adapting, but without feeling they have to essentially rewrite all the rules? Because actually we've probably got the solutions, and it's the simple ones we want to reach to. And I think the two-lane approach personally provides us with a really simple, effective solution to designing our assessments that integrate generative AI in some way, whether it be our level 7 example or our level 10 example. Anything else you want to say?
I don't think so. But hopefully we will have left time for questions at some point. Yes.
Questions?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
It feels very strange.
Yeah, doesn't it?
Yes. So I'll come back.
Yeah, I'll come back up.
Thank you very much, both of you. I'm really excited. I've seen where the results got to after hearing about the study initially. So we've got 5-ish, 10-ish minutes for questions. They're in the room, or feel free to stick your hand up or type them in the chat. Got a question in the room. Should we go into the room? Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.
Just more comments. So thanks for that. That was really interesting. And yeah, I guess I agree with the two-lane approach. You know, because the other categories, as you said yourself, it's really hard to prove it, and the boundaries are very blurry. You know, so it's very difficult to explain the boundaries to the students. Often they don't understand. You know, am I already going into like the blue category or the green category? I don't know. Am I overstepping boundaries? So yeah, I guess I agree that it's either yes or no to a certain extent, you know, because also the problem is you can't prove it, you know, so I think that's a big problem.
The other thing that I would, and I've been saying this to Kerith a lot, is also that two-lane approach is about the output of the assessment, not the process to the assessment, which I think is really important as well. So, for example, if you were to do in a secure lane, a professional conversation, then for me, it should be absolutely fine for students to be having a conversation with a generative AI tool to help them form their ideas. It's just that when they come to that professional conversation, we're probably going to do it in a secure environment. Yeah. And that's where in the professional conversation, we're going to be probing and we're going to be really understanding what knowledge they've had. Yeah. And I think other models don't necessarily look at the process in which students take and the output of assessment. They sort of lump it all into one. And I think that can be quite difficult. Because are we really saying no AI means no AI?
Shall I do the dictionary example? Okay. Yeah. So if you've got no AI, we've had some very interesting conversations both with actually staff members and students. And it says no AI. They say, oh, but what if I want to check a word, the definition of the word that's maybe on the assessment paper or something like that? Can I not just put it in ChatGPT because that's what I do? And we're like, no, it's no AI. It says no AI from, you know, across the piece. And so they're like, okay, well, what do I do? And I said, well, you know, you could go into Google and ask for an online dictionary and then you look it up. But the students are like, no, we don't have those skills. Which is interesting in and of itself, but you know, it's things like that I think sometimes we're not thinking about when we make decisions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because it's the same with driving. You know, I mean, I mentioned physical maths today. They were looking at me. You know, I mean, we are talking with a different generation, right? And we need to adapt as teachers to also be able to understand them and to be up to date with their knowledge and skills.
They didn't want to use that definition necessarily in their writing. It was just to get them past the blocker of understanding what they were being asked to do.
I think we've got a question.
Oh, we've got a question. Oh, brilliant.
So yeah, Debbie says, thank you very much. And she's wondering if you can tell them more about the implementation of the two-lane approach. So have you got any lessons learned or best practice examples?
I think it's fair to say certainly the two-lane approach is our thinking. It's not necessarily what we do as a sort of policy and process at Abertay.
Yeah.
I think it's worth Well, I think it's worth saying though about the two-lane approach in Australia is they define secure assessments often at sort of program level as opposed to modular level, which is again not something that I think is hugely common in the UK context. Certainly, there are some, but it's not in the same way as it is in Australia, which again is I suppose a whole other opportunity and can of worms that we won't get into. But essentially, their model then is at modular level. That is an open lane assessment, but we're then able to assure ourselves with program learning outcomes by having some form of secure program assessments.
And I think the other thing that we've learned from the readings, and so we've been at various ones where it's Newcastle University in Australia, not in England, and obviously Sydney, which is where this came from, and then conversations that are going on in Ireland at the moment. It's not a quick win. It does take time, and in fact, Sydney, who were the originators, took 2 years to fully implement, so that every assessment went over to either be one or the other. Yeah.
I think that's pretty quick to be
Yeah, I
honest.
think it's quite quick for yeah. If you think about that process of improving a module and all of that changes to a module. But yeah, it took 2 years in total.
But in some ways, my rambling at the end there was almost, we don't need approval processes necessarily to implement that approach. We as individual assessment designers could almost do that within the existing parameters that exist. And, you know, our approved learning outcomes, our approved typologies, and then it's thinking, what does that then mean in practice? And that's where the real design of the assessment happens. So, you know, we could still, if this was a way of doing it, implement that type of thing in our own practice or program.
Yeah, and I think, you know, everybody is in a different, you know, so like typology, does it exist already or not exist already? You know, so institutions are going to be at different stages. Yeah.
I hope this question is not too complex, and I hope that the data is probably captured in the case studies. But presumably, the modules that had the assessments that we trialed the AI use for had reading lists. And was there any evidence that those reading lists were actually utilized if they're using AI? And if they're not using the reading list, is that damaging for the module overall?
We haven't
the answer is that is out of scope. But an interesting consideration.
Yeah, and there's a work certainly at Abertay that is something I think is being thought about, because we've got a research small r coming up for the ABLE workshops, and the student guidance now really tells them the difference between what a chat, let me call it a chatbot AI can do, and then like a specific tool can do, like Research Rabbit, and then what the library search will do. So it goes through, there's now quite a lot of documentation to try and build that AI literacy of students as to the functionality. So if you haven't had a look yet, please go into the student AI guidance and follow through under the research kind of team.
The other thing just on that, and I don't know the ins and outs of the detail, but it will apply probably to all sort of library systems at all our universities, is actually if we understood how many AI tools were already integrated into those systems, we would probably be shocked. And I know, I don't know, every now and then I'll have a conversation with someone in our own sort of library team, go, oh really? Wow. So in some ways, maybe there's that direction of travel is just going to happen organically.
And in fact, the generative AI pages are on our bigger brands, which is study skills, and they should be open to the public. So anyone that's not at this institution, if you're interested in how that's being framed for the students, theoretically you should be able to get
to share that link. Okay. Debbie's just typing in the list. Almost time up.
Okay, one thought. Something that comes to my mind is that it's really important to understand what generative AI is good at and what it's not good at. And I think your two lanes actually match nicely with that, because by being able to think critically about some output you are given, that starts you to think about, is this a good answer to a question? But then when you start to work with the AI and manipulate the input and see how that changes that output, that allows you sort of to get an even deeper insight into how you can nudge the AI to be better at something. And so that ultimately, I think, still improves your understanding of the scenario and if it's good at this or it's not good at this, which is all important.
Yeah.
Emma's saying something similar in the chat. They're compiling a list of, so Emma's over at Dundee, and they're compiling a list of AI tools in the library and EdTech tools, but the challenge is keeping up
Yes.
Those.
Kerith and I are both in our AI working group here, and yeah,
We agree.
it's almost that group needs to meet daily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's time up, but thank you again so much. This has been really interesting, and I will send the recording over to Juliet, who will be sharing it wider. But hopefully it's the start of conversations and across different institutions as well, and finding out, learning from each other. So thank you very much again, and thank you to everyone for attending.